You've likely eaten at one of his restaurants, like Craft in New York City, or watched him over the past 20 seasons as a judge on Top Chef. Please welcome a chef who really needs no introduction, winner of the James Beard Foundation's coveted Outstanding Chef Award, Tom Colicchio. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks.
So this season, Top Chef goes international. There are 16 chefs representing 11 global editions. What we quickly realize is that Top Chef has, over the years, come to touch all corners of the globe. When you were filming the very first episode of Top Chef, did you ever imagine that you would one day be hosting a global competition of all-stars? And what does this moment feel like?
I'd love to say absolutely. I had that vision, 17 years ago, but no. When we first started shooting, I thought maybe we get, a couple seasons and family and friends would watch, and that was about it. We had no idea that it would turn into what it turned into, and so yeah, it's exciting. It's the show. I mean, the one goal that I had for the show, in when I agreed to do it, was just to make sure that my industry accepted it as something that was worthwhile. And I think we passed that hurdle about season 3 or 4. And we've just been fortunate that we have, season after season, we just get great talent that we cast on the show. And so we're casting chefs that are already fairly accomplished. And so it's no surprise that, we've become the standard bearer for, I think, all reality TV, to tell you the truth, not just cooking competitions. If you see our chefs that are on, they go on to open multiple restaurants, they're winning awards, they're getting Michelin stars. And so I think the mission was accomplished. It's something our industry really looks up to and holds in pretty high regards.
Yeah, speaking of which, one of the chefs from Spain has a Michelin star.
Mhm.
And from the very beginning, the depth of the season's talent pool is quite evident. As All Stars, every contestant is either a finalist or a winner. So in
Right.
the very first episode, it felt to me like we were almost in the final four. How much more difficult does that make your job as a judge?
No, the job judging, it doesn't change. I mean, I've always judged exactly the same way. It's a criteria that I set for myself, is looking at technique, looking at something, if it's cooked correctly, is a green vegetable cooked correctly? Is it green but still cooked through? Is a piece of meat cooked to the desired temperature that the chef wants I usually, you don't usually see it on camera, but I usually ask the chef, how are they looking to cook this? If they say medium rare and it's medium, well, then they failed, right? Something seasoned properly. And then you look at composition. And when I say composition, looking at all of the secondary ingredients on a plate and make sure that they're all in harmony. And then, of course, you look at the challenge itself and to see if they adhere to the challenge. And so the judging has never changed for me. It does get, when you have better chefs, it gets a little more nuanced. You're not seeing the sort of remedial mistakes, especially if you go back to like the first couple of seasons. We had some home cooks in there, and you had some maybe, chefs who weren't as accomplished, and you saw some pretty basic mistakes. You're not seeing that right now. But also keep in mind that the chefs are under a lot of pressure with that clock. So, it's very different than cooking, say, in a restaurant, even though there is a time crunch in the restaurant as well. But if you were just home creating these dishes, you wouldn't have a clock
Right.
are constantly on your shoulder. So mistakes are made because of that too. The other thing, I think, also because of the way the kitchen is set up, where the stove is so far away from the workstation and they have to run back and forth, they're not just really spending all that time on the stove, just watching every little thing. And so mistakes can happen during that period. But and also cooking on location where the conditions aren't ideal can also throw a wrench into the works. And so there's a lot of sort of the parameters that we set about in the challenge and location, things like that clearly make it more difficult than if you had the perfect conditions cooking in in your kitchen at home.
It's funny that you mentioned all of those things because you hit on my next question. What we learn at the beginning is that even though it's Top Chef, the competition actually varies from country to country. So, for example, in the first episode, we say goodbye to a contestant from France. However, we learned that in France, contestants get a minimum of an hour and a half to cook, and they always cook in studio. So it's very different than cooking on location. And I was wondering if that sort of gave the American contestants an advantage because they're used to these different parameters.
I don't think so. With the exception of Buddha, the chefs who are on, the American chefs, they haven't competed in a while. So it's not like they're competing every day, and it's
Mhm.
not like they're training for the Olympics or anything like
Right,
that.
right.
So no, I don't think so. But the France show is, I haven't seen it, but yeah, it's different. It's a 2-hour show. Um, and it's focused a lot more on technique, and they give the chefs a lot more time. And so, I mean, listen, it could be different going in if that's what you think, but I'm assuming that the producers are letting the chefs know ahead of time, like this is the way this show works. And but listen, it's an even playing field, and some of the chefs that were on different regions. They did really well the first couple episodes too. So I listen. The French chef made a very basic mistake. He didn't clean his shrimp.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. It doesn't matter if you have 2 hours to do that or 20 hours to
Right.
do that. That's a basic mistake.
Right. But speaking of which, during that first episode, there's a dish that stuck out to me. It highlighted vegetables, and I'm still fascinated by Charbel's onion dish. I've
Yeah.
never seen an onion cooked like that. Can you tell us a little bit about it and what made it a winning dish?
Yeah, it was wildly creative and taking something really humble and simple like an onion, and just the idea that he cooked it and then pulled it apart, right? He peeled back the onion layers, right? And then put I forget what he put in between each layer and kind of built it back up, but the flavor was just incredible. And it really stood out. And it was also one of these things where it was unanimous. Every single person at the table thought that was the best dish. Whenever you have that going, someone really knocked it out of the park. And so it was just an unexpected dish, taking something so simple, and you could see him. Again, I wasn't privy to all of his planning, because we're not involved in that. And so I saw it I first saw it at the same time everybody else saw it. And just watching that process of what he was thinking of going about and doing, and then watching him do it, it shows that he had some real skills. Yeah,
Totally.
he's such a young chef too. I think he's about 25 years old.
I know that's
Yeah.
one of the wild things too,
And
competing
for a
against.
25, I'm sorry to interrupt, for
Mhm.
a 25-year-old to have that much confidence to do something that simple, because usually younger chefs, they try to do a lot more and
Right.
often get tripped up because they overcomplicate dishes, and to do something that simple, or it appeared to be simple, but there were a lot of steps to make that simple dish work, and it showed a lot of confidence and a lot of range. Yeah.
Right. And he clearly didn't need his whole budget either at Whole Foods
No, no.
to pull that off. So you were filming in London when the late Queen died, right?
Mhm.
What was it like to experience that historic moment up close?
Well, what was really interesting about that is the Saturday after she passed, I was living in Notting Hill, and I walked, to Buckingham Palace, and it was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. And going through the parks, I had to go through two parks to get to Buckingham Palace. And walking through the parks, it was like just a nice Saturday. Families were out, having picnic lunches and playing ball and stuff, and then as you got closer to Buckingham Palace, you started seeing all the flowers and people coming to visit. And so it was kind of strange, because in like an hour long walk, I went from a normal Saturday afternoon in the parks in London to this worldwide event, and it was an interesting day. The Queen's motorcade passed our studio, and we all stopped and went outside and lined the streets like all the other Londoners, and kind of took it all in. But it was interesting. It's funny though, being there, and then seeing the news reports. It was very different.
Mhm.
Yes, people were paying attention, but things were still going on in London. If you just watch the news, you would think that the whole entire city just came to a standstill for 2 weeks. That wasn't the case. But every shop that you went into, there was a portrait of the Queen that was actually put on on counters. You saw it on billboards and in phone like bus kiosks and things like that.
Mhm.
And so clearly, yeah, it was a long time since there was a passing of a queen or a king. So it was something that a lot of people, talking to my driver, he didn't remember any other queen or king. That was it for him, and he was probably in his 60s, and so it was interesting being there during such a historical event. Yeah.
Great. So after initially turning Top Chef down, when you did accept, one of the things that you made sure was that the decisions would be in the hands of the judges and not the producers.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one reason that Top Chef has endured for so long and what sets it apart from different cooking shows.
I think so. I'm not going to say which show, but I was on a reality show a while back, and it was more of a design show. And I thought the person who made the worst design should go home. And they turned to me and said, no, we can't do that. I was like, what do you mean you can't? They said, oh, no, the producers won't allow us to do that. I was like, well, we're at a very different show than mine. And they were shocked that we got to make those decisions. But, you know, it's a cooking competition. And unless you're tasting that food, I'm sorry, you can't comment. You know, unless you're eating that alongside of us, you have nothing to add to the conversation. There are times when we have a hard time. Maybe a producer will come down and talk to us and say, you know, you said X, Y, and Z, you said X, Y, and Z. What are you thinking? But they don't make the decisions for us. They help us to at least just kind of remind us of what we've said in the past about certain dishes. But they don't interfere at all. It's our decision, and we take it seriously. You know, we want to make sure we get it right. I think the only difficult times that we've had in 20 seasons, and we stopped doing this. There was a while where we would split up. And so maybe I would go with Gail and one of the guest judges, and Padma would go with another guest judge. And if we had two guest judges, maybe she would go. And we would split up and have different dinners. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they didn't match up. I remember Nick and Nina in that finale. It was clear that there was one dish that, as described to me, was not the dish that we got. And so that was really, really hard to make that decision, because I can only base it on what I got. And then there was a whole other thing that Nick yelled at a waiter, and I didn't know that. I had no idea. And so I couldn't factor that into it, nor would I factor that into it. Mm-hmm. But we stopped doing that for that reason. It just became very, very difficult to judge if we were eating different meals at different times. And so, no, it's something that we take seriously, and we each have our ways of looking at food, and we try to actually get to a consensus. There are times we don't, but for the most part, we do. We'll argue it out, and we'll spend a lot of time. And again, the viewing audience sees very little of that. But we take a lot of different factors into consideration. But I think, ultimately we strive to get it right. And starting even in the early rounds. And there are times when, all the judges will come together and go, yeah, this was the worst dish. There's no discussion. Obviously, we have to have one, or there would be zero drama. Mm-hmm. And there are times that we know right away who's going to win, and there's no discussion. Sometimes it's that obvious, but other times it's not.
And it's interesting as a viewer, right? Because if I'm watching, say, American Idol, I can hear what's being sung, but I can't taste. So that requires us to put trust in you and Gail and Padma. Yeah. And also then on the contestant side, it's clear that the contestants have such respect for you as a restaurateur. How do you see your role? Do you think of yourself more as a mentor, a power broker, perhaps?
No, not a power broker, definitely a mentor though. I'm giving them honest feedback. I'm giving them the kind of feedback that I would give any chef in one of my kitchens. And what I tried to do is try to really understand what they're trying to when you're cooking at that level, it's good to understand what the chef is going for, what they're trying to accomplish, and seeing if they actually do that. And so for me, the criticism that I'm giving is just constructive criticism on how. And this is, I'm trying to be very careful. I'm not giving them feedback on how I would make the dish, because that's not the issue. The issue isn't what I would do, it's what they did. So I critique on what they did. You'll never hear me say, well, I would have done X, Y, and Z. What does it matter what I would have done? It doesn't matter. It matters what they did. And that's what I'm critiquing them on. And so for me, I think the show has become a power broker. But I think for me, I treat them like they're in my kitchen, and I'm mentoring them. And usually at the end of the season, when we finally, we don't interact with the chefs at all unless we're on camera until the finale. When I say the finale, once we announce who's winning, and then we get up, and then we're allowed to actually have conversations with them. And a lot of times the feedback that I'm getting is, thanks for the feedback. It's changed the way I look at food. It changed the way I cooked. Going through this is like a boot camp, and it's. I don't think the average person realizes how difficult it is to do what these chefs are doing, because they're, often cooking 16 hours a day. They're, being judged, quick fire, and then the elimination, and then there's one day of rest, and then they're back in it again. So it's just day after day after day. and they're putting a lot of time and a lot of effort, and it's physically demanding. And you start hearing the chefs that get to about halfway through, they'll start saying, "This is the hardest thing I've ever done." And
Wow.
these are chefs who are working in, hot kitchens and spending a lot of time on their feet, and they've come up through the ranks, and they'll all say this is as difficult as it gets. And so yeah, so for me, it's about being honest and about giving them really good feedback. It's not about power trips. I mean, some of the early seasons, we would try to pit them against each other, and they all stopped doing that, which I think is much better, because it was hard to sit back and watch them go after each other and not try to get to sort of the bottom of what was really happening. And I think we spent too much time on that, and I think it detracted from the food. And luckily, I think the show has kind of mirrored the industry and how it's changing. And so I think especially the last 6 or 7 seasons, it's just become more and more about the food. And it's, again, for the judges, it's always been, but I think for the contestants, sometimes they were trying to play a game. And I think they've all realized that game is not worthwhile even trying to play and speak with your dish and speak with your food.
Right. And speaking of the industry, I wanted to pivot to your restaurant and your career. So you were born in Elizabeth, New Jersey,
Mhm.
and your latest restaurant is Vallata. It's
Mhm.
your first ever Italian restaurant. At Salon, we have a food editor named Michael, who's from New Jersey, and he writes a column called Abbondanza. It's about the
Mhm.
abundance of family and food and Italian American cuisine. So I was wondering about your earliest memories of food, and how did your heritage inspire this restaurant?
Well, the name Vallata comes from the town that my father's family is from. It's in Campania, in Avellino, which is in south. It's a little northeast of Naples. Um, and But growing up, food was always important. I mean, as a kid, I was required to be at the table every night for dinner. My mother cooked most of the meals. Every now and then, my father would. But there's, moments in my life that I could think of how important food was. And for instance, I didn't really, think much about some of these things until the pandemic. And I was doing a lot of Zoom cooking classes. And of course, you had to spend a lot of time talking as well as
Mhm.
cooking. And I kept coming back to a few things. One was, I have a passion for fishing as well, and started fishing with my grandfather when I was very young. And I had 2 jobs in going fishing. One was I had to clean all the fish, and mostly crabs. We would go crabbing, occasionally catch fish, and also clamming. So I had to take care of all the fish, and also my other job was keeping my grandfather awake on the ride home. Looking back on it, it was the '60s, and I was probably in the front seat without a seatbelt, and my job was to keep an eye on my grandfather on the way home. And if I saw him nodding out, I would just nudge him, and he'd always have the same response: "I'm not sleeping. I'm just resting my eyes." And we always make it home, and then I would have to go into the basement and clean everything, and then bring it upstairs, and then my mother and grandmother would cook. And whenever we would go, we would catch 2 bushels of crabs and clams. And so we had a ton of food. And this wasn't just a meal for the family. This was extended family and friends would come by. And there was always 20 people around the table. And we made crab. We would steam it the way you normally would steam crab, but then we would take the shell off, take out the gills, and then cook it in marinara sauce. And so we called it crab gravy. And then we would use that over linguine. And then if we had clams, they were usually just steamed with the garlic and olive oil and some white wine, some herbs. And fish was always just fried if we caught fish. And so this was a long meal, because after you
Mhm.
eat your linguine, you're picking crab, and you're
Right.
picking crab, for a couple hours. And, the conversations would always start with, the day fishing, always the big fish that got away, that conversation. And then it would go to sports and family gossip and politics, but politics in my family, we were all on the same page. So there was no arguments there. And, but you saw at a very young age, I saw the power that food had to bring people around a table. And I
Mhm.
think that's what really attracted me to it. There was the technical side of it. I found at a very young age that I was good at it. It came very easy to me. I was fortunate when I was about 15. Um, I would have been diagnosed with ADHD. All of my children are clinically diagnosed, and I struggled reading recipes and trying to understand what
Mhm.
this recipe was trying to tell me.
Right.
And when I was about 15, my dad brought a bunch of books home from the library at work. Now, I have no idea what Jacques Pepin's La Technique was doing at a county jail library. My father was a corrections officer,
Mhm.
and yet this book came home, and the introduction it talks about how techniques and methods were really how you cook. And once you learn these techniques that he set out in the book, then you can really become a cook. And it just unlocked something in my brain. And I'm just like, wow. So this long recipe about braising a lamb shoulder, all this text that I'm trying to get through, all they're telling me is braise the lamb shoulder. Well, now I know how to do that. So now I braise a lamb shoulder. I could probably braise anything, right? It's all the same technique. And then you understand, well, at that point, when you can start flavoring different dishes and then how to combine stuff. And so this just completely changed. It really changed my life. And so I got lucky. You know, I found something that I was good at, something that I was passionate about, and was able to pursue, you know, a career. And I think I was also probably at the right place at the right time. You know, when I was graduated high school and started cooking in kitchens, this was when American cuisine was, you know, coming about. You know, Alice Waters was, you know, popularizing California cuisine and in California, and you had Jonathan Waxman at Michael's in Santa Monica, and Larry Forgione at American Place in America, and you had a bunch of French chefs doing some great stuff as well, and Barry Wine at Quilted Giraffe, and so American cuisine was really coming into its own. And you know, I was there as a young cook in the middle of all of it, and so it was I was fortunate that I found you know this calling. Yeah.
And touching on that, why did it take so long to open your first Italian restaurant?
Oh, well, you know, I grew up working in French kitchens and learning French technique. And when I was coming up, that's kind of what you did. And a lot of Italian American chefs that I know, Tom Valente and Alfred Portale, you know, we didn't open Italian restaurants. We did French kind of restaurants because that was our training. And now craft, if you really look at craft and what we were doing there, you can very easily say that was Italian, but we never told anybody that was Italian. But a lot of the style of cooking was more akin to Italian cooking than French cooking. But Vallata was the first. You know, I'm doing a Roman trattoria. That's what I'm doing, and partly because during the pandemic, you know, the restaurant originally was craft bar. And then we moved craft bar around the corner and we turned the original craft bar into our private dining room for craft. It's right next door to craft. And it's actually, the buildings are attached. Mm-hmm. And so during the pandemic, obviously we had just renovated the space and there were obviously no private parties, especially coming out of the you know, COVID. And so we had the space and was like, you know, we have to do something here. So it started out as a pop-up. And I was like, let's do Italian, let's do trattoria food. There was a book that I was inspired by a woman named Katie Perla, who just put out a second book, and she's making I think she lives in Rome. And I was like kind of really inspired by it. It was just very simple cooking and something that I was cooking a lot at home. And so I was cooking a lot at home, and I was like, you know what, I like doing this food, so let's do it in the restaurant.
Yep.
That's what it's about.
So Tom, I know we're at time. I wanted to ask you one question in closing. I ask every chef who comes on, in essence, what at the end of the day makes you cook? Why do you cook? For me, I love cooking because my grandmother is from Mexico and she taught me her traditions growing up, and that connects me with my family and culture. Sure. On a most basic level, why do you cook?
Yeah, I think cooking at home is just that. In fact, right now, my wife's Jewish. We celebrate Passover, and I just put a brisket in the oven. We're braising it, and so yeah, we get ready for the holiday. So a lot of it is about family traditions. I mean, I do a big Christmas Eve feast of, well, it's about 13 fishes now. It's something we always look forward to. But cooking in restaurants, I think, are very, very different than cooking at home. And I cook very differently in both restaurants and at home. And so I think, cooking at home is not only about adhering to tradition, but it's also creating new traditions that sort of are carried down from hopefully generation to generation. You know, I hope my children, I teach them these dishes and they'll make them for their family as well down the road when I'm, long gone. And so yeah, it's about that tradition. But for me, cooking was also something that I was good at. And so I was good at something else when I was young. When I was very young, I was a competitive swimmer and I was very good at a young age. And when I was about 13, I stopped practicing as much. And, I started now swimming in high school, and the kids that I beat when I was in the juniors, they were beating me. And it kind of bummed me out because I know if I just kept it up and kept practicing hard, I probably would have gone on swam in college. And I just kind of, just kind of messed up. And I said, if I find something that I'm good at again, I'm not going to mess up. I'm going to really give it my all. And when I started cooking in restaurants, and that's all I did. I read everything that I could read, whether it was, all the cooking magazines. Back then there wasn't internet, and so you had to go out and buy books. You had to travel to. There was a certain chef, and you wanted to see what they were doing. You had to go there. You couldn't just go on the internet and dial in. And so it was something that I just completely immersed myself in it. After working, 10, 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, I would go home and cook on Sunday, Monday. And so something I just loved. And and again, it was something also that came very easy. I never struggled with it. It all just made sense to me. I nowadays I cook for relaxation as well, especially if I have time. If I'm rushing and I got to get dinner on the table because it's getting late and the kids need to eat, then it's a bit of a hassle. But if I have a lot of time to just cook, I enjoy it. I really enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. And again, it's very different than, I cook a lot at home, especially during the pandemic. I was cooking breakfast, lunch, and dinner at home. And there's just something about it, especially if you're cooking every day at home. And I garden as well. And you start preserving stuff, and you start, whatever you made for dinner, if there's something left over, you're turning it into lunch the next day. And so there's a whole home economics piece to it too, that I just get a kick out of, especially if you're that close to it. If you're doing it every day. Now, right. I'm, in the restaurants again, so I'm not here every day, but yeah, there's something about it that I just enjoy, but it's also about producing food too. I just love gardening and love being able to make a meal from, if I go out fishing and I catch fish, and I'm getting produce out of my garden, and everything that's on the table is something that I either grew or caught. That's a good day.
Great. Yeah, I think there's just something so relaxing and centering about cooking. And if I have a stressful day, like making dinner actually puts me at ease. Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining us. A reminder to folks at home that season 20 of Top Chef is currently airing now in Bravo, streaming on Peacock. Thank you, Tom. Happy Passover and have a great day.
Thank you. Take care.